Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today I get to have a very lively chat with two women that I'm getting acquainted with, and they know each other well. They are into One Health, and if you didn't know what that was, you're going to find out because that's what they do. One of them is Laura Kahn, whom I've known a few months now, a little bit. She is at her office at Princeton University in New Jersey. And we have, say hello, Laura.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, good. And Cheryl Stroud. And Cheryl is a veterinarian and the chief executive or something of the One Health Commission. And I think you're in Florida, aren't you, Cheryl?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. Okay, I knew one of these southern places where you're not getting the snow that we have out here today. Anyway, hi.
Hello.
Good to see you. Now, these ladies know each other well because they've been working, both of them, in this area called One Health, which I had never heard of until about a year and a half ago. And now I'm enthusiastic about it. And I want them to explain just what One Health is. So, Cheryl, why don't you kick it off and start explaining what your organization is and what this thing called One Health is all about.
Great, thank you, Metta. I'm very happy to talk about One Health. For those who are not familiar, One Health is basically a global movement that's been going on now for 15 to 20 years, trying to help our human health professionals, animal health, environmental health, public health, global health, all those professions work more closely together because we end up in silos and not really communicating very closely with each other on a lot of critical issues that fall at the intersection of our professions. So that's what One Health is. The One Health Commission is a nonprofit organization based in the US, but working globally to try to facilitate these conversations and bring us together across the professions to address some of our really quote-unquote wicked challenges, things like climate change and antimicrobial resistance and emerging infectious diseases like Ebola. So that's the thumbnail version.
Okay. And you as a veterinarian will be looking at issues and diseases that are often communicable between human beings and other species.
Right, Metta. So what the public often doesn't understand is the term zoonotic diseases. Those are diseases that pass between animals and humans. And this statistic
say the word again.
Zoonotic.
Zoonotic.
Diseases.
I've
think zoo.
I never heard it pronounced before.
Well, I always called it zoonotic, but you know, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Zoonotic diseases pass between humans and animals, and what the public is often shocked to learn is that 60% of the diseases that infectious diseases that humans experience have come from the animal world. And 75% of the new and emerging infectious diseases that we're seeing are coming from the animal world. So it behooves us to have the animal doctors and the human doctors working together so they can really cross-communicate about these diseases and how to recognize them and diagnose them and handle them and prevent them.
And not only that, but so that's the infectious disease side of One Health. The chronic disease side of One Health is that animals and people get the same diseases. The disease processes are shared. So for example, cats get asthma, dogs get cancer, many animals get heart disease. And so oftentimes the process is the same, but yet the physicians and the veterinarians don't usually talk to each other. So sometimes a discovery in one field could impact another field. So let me just give you an example. There's this interesting book called Zobiquity by Dr. Barbara Natterson Horowitz. She's a physician and a cardiologist at the UCLA. She's been volunteering at the LA Zoo and was doing echocardiograms on monkeys. And she was doing an echocardiogram on a tamarin monkey and was looking at the monkey's pretty green eyes. And the veterinarian who was in the room with her said, "Please do not stare at the monkey's eyes." And she said, "Why not?" And the veterinarian said, "Because the monkey thinks that you're going to eat it and you're going to put it into stress." And there's an entity, disease entity called capture myopathy, where if a wild animal is captured, it can be so stressed by the experience that it goes into heart failure and dies.
Oh,
Well, that was discovered about 30 years ago by veterinarians. Well, Dr. Horowitz is a cardiologist, and she was stunned because just recently some Japanese cardiologists had described an entity in humans called Takasobu's cardiomyopathy. And this was a situation where the human undergoes such a stressful event like the death of a loved one or severe trauma that they go into heart failure and die. Well, it just so happens that these processes are the same, but the veterinarians discovered it 30 years earlier. And but yet, since the physicians and veterinarians weren't talking to each other, it took the doctors 30 years longer to discover this in humans. So this is a great example of where, again, disease processes can be shared across species. It's called comparative medicine. And some of the greatest discoveries in the history of medicine and public health were made at that human-animal interface. But yet, with time, the physicians and veterinarians have largely stopped talking to each other. And part of the goal of One Health is to reestablish that communication along with the environment. I just read a very interesting book called Pharmacology, spelled Pharmacology, by Dr. Daphne Miller, who's a family practitioner at UC San Francisco. And she was looking at the role of farms and soils on human health and how our microbes are crossing across this interface between the environment and people, the whole world of the microbiome, and of course, our food, how we interact with the environment is often through our food. That's largely been unappreciated and underexplored, certainly by the medical profession. The medical profession has increasingly approached patients through a reductionistic lens, looking at just organ systems rather than the entire milieu of people living in their environment, with the animals in the environment, and how all of that impacts our health. We need to start thinking broadly rather than just very narrowly if we want to really truly understand our health and well-being in our microbes.
When I first heard about zoonotic things, I only thought of it as in terms of how animals and people can have the same diseases, and that by solving the particular disease, you're helping both. But sometimes now, I wonder if you count it as One Health, if the work involves, let's say agronomy, which you're doing now. I mean, the work, the research on how to produce more food, et cetera, and what kind of soils or how to improve the soil, but also things like, let's say, what do you call these people who study bugs?
Entomologists.
Entomologists, yeah, sure. Because I mean, you're not trying to heal ticks and mosquitoes, but
Right.
you're presumably that's part of your purview, right?
Sure.
Yeah, because you're trying to find out how they're killing us, or
well, just to give you to further that, bee health, our pollinators are responsible for a huge fraction of the important fruits and vegetables that we eat. And in the United States now, veterinarians have been put in charge of prescribing any medication, particularly antibiotics, for bees. So here you have insects that are arguably one of the most important food animals that we have, since they are responsible for pollinating the plants that produce our fruits and vegetables, which is essential for human health. And so we rely on this insect for our well-being.
Mhm.
About 2 billion people on the planet actually eat insects as a form of protein. They're a very good form of protein. They don't produce a lot of waste, and a lot of people eat them. Here in the US, we generally have the ick factor and don't want to eat grubs and other insects. However, we do eat an insect of the sea, and that's called a lobster. Lobster and shrimp are, in fact, insects of the sea, and we have no problem eating them. And that was largely because of marketing, very clever marketing. Lobsters used to be considered vermin and just were fed to prisoners. And someone in the 20th century got the brilliant idea that they could turn it into gourmet food. And through clever marketing, lobsters are now, you pay top dollar for lobsters when actually they're large insects.
Uh-huh.
But we have no problem eating them, though.
Uh-huh. Oh, that is so interesting.
So Metta, you mentioned insects as being vectors, if you will, of disease, and that's another arena of One Health. So if I could just insert here, we started out this conversation talking about infectious diseases, and then Laura discussed the non-communicable diseases that we need to be learning across animal and human sectors from. But there are many other, what I like to call faces of One Health. I like to think of One Health as a diamond. If you cut a diamond in the rough into a beautiful stone, you get a lot of different facets or faces. And if you look at any one face of that diamond, you'll get a different reflective pattern that'll be very beautiful. So there are many faces of One Health. Infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases we need to be learning about, vector-borne diseases that can be passed, carried by mosquitoes or ticks. So that's a whole nother arena. Climate change, antimicrobial resistance, the comparative medicine that Laura was talking about. So there are many, many arenas that are begging for us to come together and work together across professions.
Here, let me ask you a new angle. Do you count this? Because last night, I've created this page on the website that we have, tosavetheworld.ca, for One Health. And now and then I want to put in comments or articles that I have found. So I put it on your page, and I'm not sure whether you would approve. And that is an article about the importance of microplastics. That in the ocean, there are these almost microscopic pieces of plastic, which the fish eat, and then we eat the fish. And so we're getting these particles in our body and so on. Do you call that One Health? Would you call
Absolutely, absolutely. This is the human impact on the environment, and then the feedback of that environmental impact on the animal health and the human health. This is a prime example of the inextricably exquisite interconnectedness of all of these systems, the humans, the animals, and the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, what's happening with microplastics is actually proving to be devastating to many marine mammals. I just saw a piece yesterday, an article yesterday, about how the microplastics are very, very much detrimentally harming whale sharks and many of our marine mammals.
Harming what?
Whale sharks is a giant marine mammal, a very incredible, fascinating animal. Not a whale shark. They're beautiful. And many people who work in the One Health ocean marine arena feel that the marine mammals can be sentinels. This is another face of One Health, can be sentinels for what's happening in the environment that humans and animals are both being exposed to, because we live in a shared environment, right? We all live in the same environment, whether it's a pet sleeping in your bed or a whale swimming in the ocean. It's an indicator of the health of that environment. So, I mean, I hope it's starting to become clear that our impact on the environment and the connectedness of how what we're doing to the environment can affect the animals and the people. It's just all very interconnected.
Now,
That's why it's so important we do this.
Case, a topic is, I've been very engaged lately with talking with people who are doing work on the effects of radioactivity on people and on animals, and even the genetics of plants where there's fallout, or where around Chernobyl or Fukushima and so on. Would you call that research also part of One Health?
I absolutely would. Laura?
Yeah, I mean, radiation is going to affect the environment, environmental health. If you're exposed to a lot of radioactivity, you're at an increased risk for cancers. We saw that with Chernobyl, certainly. When you start contaminating, I mean, look, we're contaminating our environment with either our radioactive waste or our plastic waste or our fecal waste. As Cheryl mentioned, these marine animals are literally choking to death on our plastic waste. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if we want to have a habitable planet, we really have to start cleaning up all of our waste that we're polluting the planet with. Otherwise, these animals should be serving as important sentinels for us. We need to pay attention to their deaths, because what's killing them is going to eventually kill us. I mean, we don't want to be the only creatures left on this planet. We want to have biodiversity, because that's extremely important. So we really need to pay attention to the waste that we're creating, and we need to become much more focused on recycling and reducing our negative impact on the world around us.
Now, Laura, you also said just before we started, before Cheryl arrived, that you're interested in the soil, the content of microbes in the soil and so on, as having to do with our food and presumably food of animals and so on. Yeah, so that the beauty of what you're doing is that you really are blurring the boundaries between a bunch of things. And that's really why I wanted to start this project, Save the World, to bring together people who are working on a whole bunch of different areas, but they're not so different, because all of them are interdependent. And not many of them, I have to do something extraordinary to bring together people who are working, let's say, on cyber attacks and the people who are working on famine, because they don't normally get together. So it's only when you look at things as a system, a larger system, that you begin to see the connections among a whole bunch of things that are. What's the future of this? What can we do? Maybe I'm jumping the gun by moving to that question too soon, because I want to hear more about cases of topics that you're working on. But I just love the idea that you're showing the connections and getting people out of their silos.
Well, we live in a microbial world. And in fact, our bodies are more microbial than human, because we have microbes, trillions of microbes living on us and in us. And our microbiome, the microbes that live on us, interact with the microbes around us, whether it's in the environment or the other animals that we're sharing our homes with or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so we need to understand how our microbial world works, and we need to understand how it's impacting on us, and in order to improve our lives, our health and our well-being. We have relied on antibiotics to treat bacterial infections, and that's been very important in saving lives. But at the same time, these antibiotics have come with certain problems. And there's been an excellent book that I highly recommend people read called The Missing Microbes by Martin Blaser. He's an infectious disease doctor who's
How do you spell his last name?
Blaser, Martin Blaser. Okay. The missing microbes. He's discovered that antibiotics, they wipe out good bacteria along with unwanted bacteria. And sometimes antibiotics are treated for diseases that aren't even bacterial, because we don't always know what we're dealing with. It's kind of the shotgun approach to medicine. You write a prescription for an antibiotic and you hope for the best. And so with this approach to treatment, we're, impacting the whole biome, and we rely on these microbes for our health and disease as much as we do any organ, whether it's our lungs or our heart or our kidneys. And so when you start killing them off, it has unintended consequences, including the rise of obesity, the rise of autoimmune diseases, certain cancers. He's found connections with all of these with the biome. And this has been largely unappreciated. It's a whole new field that's growing.
Let me toss in something I just heard the other day, because I went down to have coffee with a woman named Kate Brown, who's written a book about Chernobyl. She's at MIT. And so we had a good conversation. She was in Toronto to a convention of, I think, biophysicists. She was giving a talk about her findings about Chernobyl, which are pretty horrendous. And she said that their current theory is, she was describing some very sort of strange symptoms that didn't really describe any particular disease. It was a little peculiar. Nobody quite knew what to make of the vast numbers of irradiated, exposed people who had these odd symptoms. They think it's that they've ingested radioactive substances which have done something to their microbiome in their gut, and that's what's causing the symptoms that she's discovered. Wouldn't that be interesting? I'm
sure the radioactivity is not only affecting the microbes in them, but probably also the human cells as well. Radioactivity is going to affect all life forms, so.
Well, I know you've done work on this, but Cheryl, I would wonder if you would take a different position, because, or no, I'm not going to jump to that conclusion. But Laura's book was about, one of her books is about the dangers of microbe resistance because of misuse of antibiotics. But part of the misuse is feeding it to animals to fatten them up. Can you explain to me why that fattens anybody up, or any animals, and how it works and what to do about it? Because if it's hurting everybody if they misuse it.
Yes, Laura wrote a wonderful little book that I highly recommend. The title of it is One Health and the Politics of Antimicrobial Resistance. And she outlines a beautiful history of how we learned, after antibiotics were introduced in the 40s, how we learned by accident, Laura, you can elaborate on this, on how animals that are getting antibiotics in low levels actually grew faster. And so that knowledge got incorporated into much of our intensive agriculture. And we realized, as the antimicrobial resistance phenomenon emerged and our awareness grew, that we needed to stop that. So many countries have. In the US, we have outlawed the feeding of antimicrobials of human interest to animals at low levels to promote growth. We still use antibiotics in animals under a veterinary prescription if the animals get sick, because we don't want animals to be sick, especially if we're going to feed them to people. So, but that practice of feeding antibiotics at low levels for growth promotion has been outlawed in the US. And Laura, you can tell us which other countries. I know the Netherlands were one of the first countries to do this.
Right, the Scandinavian countries have been very proactive about this. But Metta, you have to realize that when this was during World War II, that this discovery was accidentally made, that low-dose antibiotics can dramatically increase growth of the animals and reduce mortality. Now, at that time, food security was of utmost concern. The US was feeding its British allies, and meat was very expensive. They were using it primarily to feed the soldiers. There was a black market in the United States. Animals, in order to grow and to build muscle for the meat that we consume, have to have a protein source. And before World War II, the protein source was either fish meal from Japan or cod liver oil from Norway. Well, those supplies dried up during World War II, and the US was desperate to find an alternative. So this one researcher, Dr. Thomas Jukes, was certain that it was going to be vitamins that could serve as a substitute. He was feeding these animals vitamins, but discovered accidentally that it wasn't the vitamins that was causing the dramatic growth and reduced mortality. It was the low-dose antibiotic residues that were used during the production of these vitamins. And that discovery, I mean, the animal mortality rate in the control groups, I mean, almost all the animals would die, but with the low-dose antibiotics, most of them, they only lost one animal. So this was very dramatic, had a huge impact on food security, excuse me, and was quickly adopted around the world. So at that time, antimicrobial resistance was more of a theoretical threat than an actual threat. Mm-hmm. Now, the situation is reversed, where antimicrobial resistance is a real threat, and concerns about food security, at least in the United States, is more of a theoretical threat. Americans have been very fortunate in that we have not experienced an environmentally induced famine. The last time was probably during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. That generation that experienced that is rapidly diminishing. And so most Americans have no experience in environmentally induced famine. With climate change, that is a very real risk and could lead to environmentally induced famine on a global level. So I'm very concerned.
I'm sorry, are you saying that if that happened, there'd be again a motivation to try? I mean, how does that connect?
Okay, so concerns about food security right now, again, as I said, it's mostly theoretical, but climate change is jeopardizing that. And so we're going to have to start coming up with strategies to ensure food security, to enable civilization to continue, since agriculture and the food security it provides is the foundation of civilization.
I read something yesterday, I may be going off track, but something that surprised me. They can get CO2 out of, suck it out of the atmosphere, combine it with water and electricity, and they make a food out of it. Now, the article was very interesting because they ferment this stuff.
Right. I think you're talking about nitrogen for plants. Is that correct?
Nope. This is something meant for people. It's going to be produced for billions of people, they say. It tastes like and looks like wheat flour. And it's, it sounded like magic. But then in the almost what I would call small print, they say in the process of fermenting it and creating the stuff, they mix it with vitamins and nutrients, which of course they don't elaborate how much vitamins and nutrients. Maybe that's all it is vitamins and nutrients mixed with something else. But that the real food value comes from, I don't know. But I just wonder, because this was such an amazing notion that you could take thin air and make it into food for people. And they're going to be
have to read that article.
It up. Huh?
Yeah, you need to share that with us, Metta. It could be that they're pulling the carbon out of the CO2 of the atmosphere, because most sugars and everything are based on carbon. So you build the molecules with carbon. So if they're harvesting the carbons from the CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's chemistry, turning that into sugars and structures that we can eat. I mean, much of our plant fibers are carbons. They're all carbon molecules. So
right, that's how we get our carbohydrates, right? The photosynthesis does it for us. They take the carbon and make it into sugar.
Well, it's the sunlight, though, that the photosynthesis is turning into food for us.
There's another thing connected. I don't know where it's connected, but I've also read that there are bacteria called methanotropic bacteria, which are found mostly, I guess, in swamps and places like that. that actually are good at breaking down the methane molecule. And there are very few things that can break a methane molecule apart, but it consumes the carbon and sequesters the carbon. So it sounds like magic. You know, all we have to do is make huge vats of this stuff and spread it around, and it ought to absorb a lot of the methane that's being produced, especially by cattle. And,
Well,
you know,
there are a lot of bacteria. Well, the cattle, they're called ruminants because they have a chamber of their stomach called the rumen that has methanogenic bacteria where they ferment the feed that the animals are eating and release methane. So that's how cattle burps, they burp up the methane, and that is a major contributor to methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, to the atmosphere. So that has to be reduced. That is a very serious problem. It's a more short-lived greenhouse gas, but a very potent one.
But we're told that we have to stop eating meat because these animals are the source of so much methane. But I've been interested in some of the work that these guys in Siberia are doing. And they say, others say, that during the Pleistocene period, there was a huge amount, there were several times as much flesh, big animals on the planet as there are now. Even counting human bodies. So, but the methane levels in the ice core show that they were just fine. In other words, you could have a whole lot more animals that were ruminants burping and farting and creating all this methane, but something was keeping it in balance because it was lower levels of methane in the atmosphere than now. So I wonder, could this have been methanotropic bacteria in the soil?
Well, you've got methanotropic and methanogenic. So some are going to be breaking it down and some are going to be producing it.
Right.
But I mean, you know, during the Pleistocene, you didn't have the 7 billion humans, and we've altered the planet in major ways. So it was a different planet back during the Pleistocene, and I can't speak about it because I have not studied the Pleistocene to talk about what were the conditions during that era.
Well, Cheryl, are veterinarians working on trying to solve this particular problem? And would you call that part of One Health? The solution of the emission of methane by animals?
I would say it is definitely a One Health issue. And in answer to your question about our veterinarians working on this, yes, but not enough. We've got some major societal issues we're going to have to really think seriously about. And it's not just the veterinarians that will be able to address it. It's going to have to be all professions, including the social scientist. One of the things that's driving some of our major problems is population. How are we going to feed 9 billion or 10 billion people?
I saw a prediction the other day, 11 billion.
I hadn't heard the 11
now are
billion.
saying it's going to hit 11 billion before it tapers off and reverses.
So, one of the things that nobody wants to talk about is how to curb our population expansion. How are we going to have that conversation? I mean, you look at what China tried to do and limit the number of children. I think they've relaxed that now because they realized that their population wasn't expanding as much as they wanted it to. But as a global society, how are we going to deal with that? So One Health can help us. I hope, my sincere passion is that One Health can help us have these conversations. I like to call some of the pages I do on the Commission's website no judgment zones, where any topic can be discussed without people getting all offended. Just bring the challenges forward and let's have the conversations that we need to have. One of the beautiful things that Laura did in her book about antimicrobial resistance, One Health and the Politics of Antimicrobial Resistance, is she really evaluated what was going on and stopped the finger pointing. For years, there was finger pointing. The animal world was saying, oh, it's those physicians writing too many prescriptions inappropriately. And the physicians were pointing fingers at the veterinarians saying, oh, it's those veterinarians feeding antibiotics to animals. And one of the things Laura was able to do is say, wait a minute, let's look at this big picture. How did we get here? It's really nobody's fault. What are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. So, yes, absolutely. The questions that you're raising are definitely in the realm of One Health conversations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perfect. Okay.
I would like, if you don't mind, to go back to the soil issue and kind of marry that with the antimicrobial resistance discussion. One of the things that Laura was able to point out in her book, One Health and the Politics of Antimicrobial Resistance, was all the antibiotics residues that are getting into our waterways and not only contaminating our waterways and eventually our oceans, but also our soils. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we're not talking about enough yet, I'm just starting to hear a little bit of it, is how those antimicrobial residues are affecting the soil microbiome. It's been stated that the soil microbiome is as important as our gut microbiome, Absolutely. Which we know is incredibly important for not just digestion of our food, but for our immunity. And even some of the neural hormone circuits between our gut and our brain. So these are incredibly complex issues that we have got to be working on together and paying attention to. So I get really excited when I hear a horticulturalist or a soil, what is the word? A soil scientist mm-hmm. actually embracing and trying to help with these conversations, bringing their knowledge about soils to the greater conversation within One Health.
Right. So along those lines, we are working against nature rather than with it through our massive amounts of waste that we're producing, and particularly fecal waste. So there's right now over 7 billion humans, and we've got over 30 billion food animals. The food animals, the humans, are producing massive amounts of waste. The solids have to go somewhere, and it's usually used as fertilizer. Oftentimes in poor countries, this animal fecal manure, which makes up about 80% of all the manure, is used, gets placed on agricultural fields where they mix with the soil. And so we are increasing our microbial burden in our environment and changing it. And with our use of antibiotics in both medicine and agriculture, we're changing what's called the global resistome. Most of our antibiotics come from the microbes that are in the soil, but we don't know which microbes those are because they're very hard to culture in a laboratory. And so recently, scientists came up with a very clever strategy of extracting DNA directly from the soil. This is called metagenomics. We don't necessarily know from which microbes that DNA is coming from, but nevertheless, they were able to look at the DNA and they found antimicrobial resistance genes everywhere. They found them in the Arctic, they found them in the Antarctic, they found them in places that never experienced human anthropogenic antibiotic exposure. And so what that suggests is that antimicrobial resistance genes are ancient, they're everywhere, and with our massive influx of manure, we are changing what's called the global resistome of the planet. And the bacteria are able to share all of these resistance genes much faster than we can develop new antibiotics.
Wait a minute, by sharing it, you mean they can pick up parts of the DNA and incorporate it so that the resistance can spread among in the microbial
conjugation. It's bacterial sex. They can pick up these microbial resistance genes, they can share it crossways, or they can divide and their progeny will have them. And so we are, in other words, we are working against nature and nature is winning. What we have to do is we have to think smarter in order to live in our microbial world. Now, there is a natural foe to bacteria, and Cheryl's heard this because I'm a big proponent of bacteriophages. Now, bacteriophages are the most prevalent bioform on the planet. They are these tiny little viruses that will infect bacteria and kill them. And there was a lot of interest in the early 20th century in the US, but it's much easier to use antibiotics than phages because phages are very, very specific. You have to know exactly what you're treating. You don't need to know that with antibiotics. So phages are much more targeted. They would provide a more effective, if you will, way to treat infections without damaging the good bacteria. And I highly recommend both a book and a TED Talk. The book is called The Perfect Predator by Dr. Stephanie Strathdee, Strathdee. She and her husband are both faculty at UC San Diego School of Medicine. They were vacationing in Egypt when her husband came down with a pan-resistant Acinetobacter baumannii infection. He had to be medevaced back to San Diego, where he was in the ICU with multi-organ failure and dying from this resistant infection. Was resistant to all the antibiotics. She went online, did some searching, and stumbled upon this old treatment called bacteriophages. She contacted some phage researchers around the country, and they started working around the clock for several days to find the exact phages to help her husband, beat this infection. They infused the phages into his bloodstream and into his abdomen where the infection was. And 3 days later, he woke up and he was cured. And this was the first time this happened in North America, where this revolutionary old treatment was used. So there's now quite a bit of interest in bacteriophages. There's still a lot of challenges that have to be overcome. It's very expensive, they're very time consuming. You'd have to think of it more like, personalized cancer treatment, where you have to know exactly what you're treating to find the exact treatment. So it can't be mass produced the way antibiotics are. It has to be tailored, which again is very expensive, very time consuming in order to be used. It's not, there's no FDA approval yet. And there's still not enough research being done. Now, UC San Diego, as a result of this cure, they have started a bacteriophage research and treatment center, the first of its kind in North America, in the Americas. And so The Perfect Predator is her book, and the TED Talk is called How Sewage Saved My Husband's Life. So Google how sewage saved my husband's life, and you will hear her very riveting description of what she went through to save her husband using this unorthodox treatment. But I truly think that that's working with nature, because they are the natural foes to bacteria rather than antibiotic, which the bacteria use to communicate with each other in the soil.
I think it's been 30 years ago that I had a woman friend whose grown son had a leg infection, couldn't be cured. I think it was Bulgaria he went to, someplace like that.
Tbilisi, Georgia. They
Georgia?
had the Eliava Institute that has been used.
It cured him, but it wasn't an easy thing to do.
No, it's not. That's right.
Can they speed that up? Because it sounds like if you've got a critical, like this man who almost died, time is of the essence.
Right.
They always have enough time to culture this thing.
Right.
And identify it. And can that be sped up a little bit?
Well, we need new technologies for it. There's some interest in genetically engineering phages to make them easier to use, perhaps. So it's all in its infancy. So I would argue that the whole practice of medicine is in a transition right now. There's going to be much more emphasis on our biome, on the microbes. When you go for a checkup, they're going to check your microbes to see, what the composition is like.
Mhm.
And, you know, and any kind of infection or other problem is going to be looking at, you know, what alterations are going on in your biome, and then trying to reestablish the balance, if you will, the balance that goes on to allow us to be healthy.
Well, now, would this be a way of transitioning out of, I mean, just saying we've lost the game when it comes to antibiotics. We can't find any more of them to fill the lost ones that we can't use anymore. So we have to move over into using phages instead? Or is this something like, well, let's try to use both, just try to find new, I mean, is it worthwhile investing in research on more mysterious and unknown antibiotics?
Sure. I mean, I don't see phages as completely replacing antibiotics anytime soon. We rely on antibiotics too much.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is developing new ones to counteract all this resistance that's being developed. So in the meantime, you know, we have to start looking at alternatives to overcome these resistant infections. Now, whether or not phages are the answer, I don't know. It's still too early to tell. But I think that that they provide a very interesting and important strategy to treat some of these resistant infections.
Mm-hmm. Cheryl, what does it matter about to veterinary medicine if if there's an effort to curb the use of antibiotics? I mean, certainly, I guess you've agreed that you want to stop feeding it to them just to fatten up the cattle, but do you sometimes need? Is it being misused otherwise in veterinary medicine as well as with people?
Well, there are practices that we need to rethink. And part of the reason antibiotics are needed in our current systems is that we crowd animals together in abnormal settings and feed them things that they wouldn't naturally eat. And to keep them healthy, then they need antibiotics. So I think this might not be a very popular thing to say as a veterinarian, but I think we're going to have to seriously rethink how we're going to feed ourselves without having to cram animals together in very tight spaces that require them to have antibiotics just to stay healthy.
Right.
So that's a very, I mean, we could talk about this for 100 years because that's, you know, the intensive agriculture is incredibly important, but I think we need to rethink a lot of it, how we're going to do this. And there are many veterinarians, of course, who work with the intensive agriculture companies. And the protein that's produced is incredibly important. And we're starting to see these systems replicated around the world. I think we're going to have a collective global reevaluation of the systems, as here we are again with the idea of systems that we use to produce the food to feed ourselves. I would like to see us move to more holistic systems. I've seen some articles where in some countries, in fact, I saw an article recently, I've just visited Colombia, and there was a kind of a pioneering, I forget what they called it, I forget the term they were using, but they were grazing cattle on grasslands that were interspersed with trees that were also productive. So they had put the animals in situations where they were not crowded, they were in more holistic settings, and they were using the land for the animals, the grasses, and the trees. And I can't remember what the trees were, nut trees or some kind of trees that were also producing food. So I think we're going to have really serious conversations about how to do more of that and less of intensive settings to produce our protein.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, along those lines, I guess we can get even more theoretical. The United Nations has declared that food is a human right, but they didn't declare what kind of food. And the question is a meat-rich diet a human right? Because for most of human history, or at least during European history, it was only the very wealthy who could afford meat. The poor were eating gruel and vegetables and a much less rich diet. I don't think any politician alive is going to want to curtail meat production because people want to eat meat, they like meat. you can certainly live a fine life as a vegetarian or a vegan, provided that you get the supplements that you need that you can only get through animal proteins, including vitamin B12. So I think it's unrealistic to expect everybody, the whole world, to become vegetarian. I don't think that's going to happen. So Cheryl's absolutely right that we need to figure out how are we going to provide animal proteins in a way that's not going to further harm our environment. I have mentioned that 2 billion people eat insects. They provide a very good protein source, and a lot of people, as I said, eat them. The challenge is overcoming the ick factor, in particularly in wealthy Western nations, to provide nutrition. So we have a lot of really challenging questions that we need to discuss as a society, as global society, of how are we going to have a sustainable world to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Their second priority is to end hunger. That's food security. But they're not talking about how to do that. They just say they want to do it. So how do we do it while ensuring that we sustainably continue, our planet's biome and biodiversity?
So Metta, I know we only have a few minutes left. I'd just like to bring up one more point that I think is incredibly important. The way we're going to address a lot of these problems is we're going to have to start very early with education for children. And I mean, not even starting in undergrad and college. Let's, start very early, instilling some of the basic attitudes about protecting Mother Earth rather than using up everything, that people are the most important species, that we've got to change that attitude. So I just would like to urge that the world become aware of our need to be inserting education about not necessarily the term One Health. It's a fabulous term and kids need to understand it, but more specifically, some of the issues and arenas that they're falling within what we're talking about, and start teaching that very early. So I know Laura and I have been very involved working together in some One Health education programs. We're trying to find ways to take education about One Health issues and One Health in general down to very early grades. One example of that is a bat rabies education team, because we realized that nobody was teaching children and parents not to touch a bat. And the public doesn't realize that bats can carry rabies. So we've been trying to do that education. But other things, and Laura, you can elaborate here, because I know you feel strongly about some of the ways that we can be teaching children starting very early. So, we're starting to work on those things, and this is not new. Many movements have tried to do this, insert their education very early on in education. But I think education, starting with children, but also for the public, we're really not getting a lot of this message out to the public. And that would then bleed over to our funding agencies and our lawmakers to understand the incredible urgency. I mean, right now there's a bill in the US before our Congress urging our federal agencies that are focused on human or animal health to work more closely together. And we're trying to help our lawmakers understand the critical urgency of that. And this particular bill is framed in emergency preparedness and how to be working together across sectors at a federal level to be ready for an outbreak of Ebola or influenza, which we could have a pandemic that could kill millions of people like in 1918. So the education component is really critical here.
Absolutely, Cheryl. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think a key word here is respect. We have to respect ourselves in order for us to respect others, not only other people, but other animals. We need to respect our planet, the environment in which we live, to not trash it, to not view it as purely something to exploit. We have to treat our planet with the respect it deserves. It's our only home. And One Health, I think, provides an important strategy to do that, to recognize that we're all in this together, that our health and our well-being is inextricably linked to the health of other people, the other animals, and to our environment. And we need to start changing how we view ourselves in this planet. We are not above everything, we are part of everything, and we need to recognize that we depend on the planet and the life on the planet for our own health and well-being.
Mhm.
So,
Beautiful. Now, look, besides what you've both said, my own interest is in not just in educating young people, but educating professionals themselves to realize the linkage between the various silos that they're all working in. I mean, we've talked about entomology and social science and people making how to make better toilets. I hope the fecal problem and the microbiomes and the microbes in the soil and the agronomy and cattle production and how to graze cattle or whether to put them in feedlots. Oh my God, all of these things have, it blurs from one domain to another. And I don't think that many professionals working in particular fields are sufficiently eager to blur the boundaries between these different areas and to see the connections among the different problems that exist. Do you? Or maybe it's it's that I'm just becoming aware of it myself, and I think other people need to also.
Well, I think,
go ahead, Cheryl.
so Metta, our systems, again, have forced us into these silos in this way of thinking. Just for example, in academia, if you're going for tenure, you've got to publish specifically in the most elite journal that you can publish in to get the most brownie points for getting tenure. And that does not reward you for working with people in other professions, because if you have an article you need to publish that really taps a lot of professions, where do you publish it? Well, you end up publishing it in a more general arena. So that's just an example of some of our systems problems. Here's another systems problem. Much of our research around the world is funded by public dollars, but it often gets published in journals that only people in that profession or for that journal can get access to without paying big fees. And so that's another thing that has forced us into silos.
I mean, I'm thinking of the sociology journals that I am familiar with, where you might get 3 people reading your article. All you really want to do is get it on your CV that you published it, and whether or not it ever gets.
Right, so this is a systems challenge. Why is it like that? What can we do? Now, open access publishing is helping, and it's got its own challenges, but it is really helping. And I know Frontiers has been a fabulous organization for trying to bring open access publishing. So it all boils down to what can we do? What can we do about it?
What I'm doing, and that is what we're doing right now. That is, I've created this website called tosavetheworld.ca, which is a place where people who have campaigns of any kind that bear on solving the 6 most urgent global threats in the world can have a page and each display their own issues and maintain their own comments columns and their own event listings and so on. And yet it's all on one site, where I would hope that people who look at their own page would once in a while go look at somebody else's page and see the connections between them. But that was my purpose, is to become more ecumenical, as it were.
Well, I think one of the important things about your website is it serves as kind of a counter towards the academic and societal emphasis to become increasingly specialized in what we do. We've become increasingly specialized in medicine, certainly, but we need people to think broadly, to see the big picture, to be able to recognize all these connections between ourselves, the other animals, and the environment, to look at it in a broad-based way, to address some of these larger societal issues that we're not teaching in the schools. We're just teaching people to prepare for a job doing X, Y, or Z. We're not training people or educating people to think about the large societal picture of where are we going and how can we continue our civilization.
I,
And Metta,
I
that's not to say that we don't need our specializations. We've learned
Right, that's
incredible things from our specializations. We need them. We just need to maintain an ability to see the
right.
big picture and remain connected across the professions. And that's
you know,
the One Health call.
Yeah,
Isaiah Berlin had this
say that,
category.
I, I didn't mean to say that we didn't need specialists. We
Mhm.
certainly do, but we also need generalists.
Isaiah Berlin distinguished between foxes and hedgehogs. A fox is somebody who knows a little bit about a lot of things, but no deep thing. And I'm a fox. I think you guys are too, maybe. A hedgehog is somebody who knows one thing very well, but not the big picture. So we
Right.
need both. We need both.
Well,
foxes
the
and
problem is we have hedgehogs with blinders on.
That's right. So we're going to overcome that. Look, you've done wonderful work already, and I'm just so delighted to make your acquaintance and think of ways in which we can keep on working together. So
Terrific.
bless your hearts, and I think
so
Laura
much,
has to go someplace, and so I'm going to let her go.
Thank
Pleasure,
you, Metta.
pleasure to talk
Okay.
with you.
Okay, we'll see you again sometime. And bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.